Thank you. It's Wijnand, but everybody in another country immediately turns it into Wijnand. So you can just use Wijnand. Well, good to hear that awareness regarding biodiversity is increasing. Of course, the big question, I guess, will be to what extent that awareness also translates into buying behavior. For private consumers, but definitely also, I would say, for the government procurement that I'm going to talk about. I think a lot of issues that have been mentioned today, be it about consumption, be it about environmental profit and loss accounts, be it about the challenge of actually doing what you say, also comes back in the whole biodiversity, the procurement part. Government, to a large extent, is a big buyer. Of course, not for all product groups. The European Commission also has a policy on green public procurement, and in 2008 they also decided on 10 specific target groups, 10 high priority product groups for green public procurement. And it was based on procurement level. It was based also on the idea of what kind of environmental benefit could we actually get from these product groups. Some of these product groups were, for example, furniture. It was about textiles, energy, construction, ITC within offices, paper. Those are the kind of product groups where government's actually a big procurer, a big buyer, you could say. And from that sense, of course, government could also be a launching customer. It could act as a big client for companies that take that next step with regard to biodiversity. And of course the big question is, how can you achieve that and how can you actually do that? In the Netherlands we also have a sustainable public procurement policy in place. We have 6 different product clusters, and in those 6 clusters we have 48 different product groups, and for all of these product groups different criteria have been developed. Partly based on the criteria that we have on a European level, but also partly based on the market reality that you would have in the Netherlands as well. There's a focus on both social and environmental issues. There's also a focus on bio-based. There's a focus on circular economy. And of course, when you talk about these different policy themes, the question is also to what extent does it also already address biodiversity? To what extent could there also be trade-offs if you're talking about bio-based, for example, and a shift from non-renewable to renewable? And I think it would be interesting to see to what extent it is actually already integrated. In 2013, UNEP did a study globally, basically, to see, okay, what kind of environmental aspects are cited by national governments as being a priority. And what you see, and not surprisingly, of course, energy scores very high. CO2 and other emissions, waste, water, hazardous substances, they all score very high when you're talking about those priorities. Biodiversity, 25%, which to a certain extent I would think is not even that bad. Of course, important to realize those issues that score a lot higher also relate to the drivers when you're talking about the loss of biodiversity. So even if it was not mentioned, government would still, to a very high extent, focus on very important drivers of the loss of biodiversity. So why that focus? Well, like I said, the role as a launching customers for companies that set that extra step. In the Netherlands, we have a specific business and biodiversity initiative as well, which is called the Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystems and Economy. And you see that the front runners within that platform also expect the government to take that extra step and to also, to a certain extent, reward the steps that they are taking as companies, especially if the government for you is an important client. More than this, also, a focus on biodiversity in sustainable public procurement could also add to all kinds of policy objectives. Like it's also been shown this morning, for example, when you talk about green infrastructure, on building with nature, there are lots of relations between biodiversity and other societal needs. If you talk about health, if you talk about climate adaptation, for example, there's a very clear link. So integrating a focus on biodiversity within public procurement can also help government to reach other objectives as a government. And especially also if you source locally, which to a certain extent I think is also a trend where you see that not only government but even also companies try to find local resources and try to close the loops. And if you source locally, then focusing on biodiversity and focusing on the benefits, the win-win situations between biodiversity and other policy objectives could be a real asset. When you're talking about sustainable public procurement, total cost of ownership, life cycle costing is really interesting. This morning already a few things were explained also by True Cost, for example, about looking at the whole life cycle of products, looking at the whole life cycle of services. And when you look at that whole life cycle, you could also look at the costs, not just the direct costs, which could be procurement, in the use phase and also in the waste phase, but also at the externalities. And especially, I guess, when you're talking about governments, who in the long run may also pay for these externalities, by also focusing on externalities and integrating them into life cycle costing, could be an opportunity to make the right decision in your procurement strategy. And of course, through sustainable public procurement, also try to influence the buying behavior of private persons, but also of corporate, of companies. And also, the companies that may use those same criteria in their purchasing decisions, and the companies that want to meet the public procurement criteria by asking the questions to their suppliers. Looking at sustainable public procurement, in practice what you see are different levels of integration of environmental aspects and social aspects. The basic level would be to prescribe. You have minimum requirements. In many cases they focus on the use of hazardous substances, the use of sustainably produced wood, for example. And of course, in using minimum requirements as a government, you must be sure that you will have enough suppliers that can actually meet those criteria, because otherwise your tender wouldn't work. This will already lead to some kind of a, you could say, a basis in the market where you say, okay, we will not go below this as a government. To take it a step further would be to use the award criteria. And that's more about actually challenging the market, about challenging the suppliers and the producers to take a step further. And of course, this provides the opportunity to also focus on maybe technological innovation, which is not common practice yet, but you already have the front runners in the market that could take that extra step. For example, by integrating more recycled content in the product, maybe also by further reducing the energy use of the product or the service, the service. So technical innovation, again, I guess the profit for biodiversity could even be a bit higher. The third level would be functional specification, where you do not ask for a specific product or you ask for a specific service, but basically you ask for a functionality to the market, and you ask the market to come up with the best solution for this. So if you're talking about an office space, for example, you wouldn't ask the market to supply, let's say, desks and chairs. Now you would ask the market to supply a solution for people to work in the office. And there you would find concepts which were also mentioned this morning already, like building with nature, when you're talking about procurement of infrastructure, for example, and construction. Green infrastructure. This is the level, I guess, where you would find more opportunities of actually looking at the different services that biodiversity provides and using biodiversity and those services in the kind of functionalities that you need. And that could also lead to benefits from the viewpoint of costs in the use phase, in the waste phase, but also related to those externalities. Of course, there's also European legislation regarding procurement. You cannot just do anything, do everything. There's a directive from 2014, which also talks about the most economically advantageous tender. You do not have to necessarily limit your decision to price, but you can also involve other aspects. And life cycle costing is, from that respect, an interesting example. So companies can, or governments can actually stimulate innovation in this sense. So it's not just about awarding, but also about stimulating innovation. So what to do then, if you already have a procurement policy in place as a government, like most governments already have? Well, first of all, if you look at your product group, of course, again, a whole focus on the supply chain. Not really new, I think in green public procurement, that was also already part of the game. The graph that you see on the right side on the top is there. You can see that in certain sectors, the indirect impact on biodiversity is much higher than the direct impact. A high direct impact you would find, for example, in oil and gas. A high indirect impact would probably be in something like food processing. And then if you look at the whole supply chain, this example is for textiles or corporate wear when you're talking about procurement, and you would see that probably in the raw materials phase, and I think it was also shown by the EPNL this morning, the potential impact on biodiversity could be the highest, for example, because of cotton production. In this way, you could have a look at the different product groups that you focus your public procurement on and develop some kind of a biodiversity heat map. Where you would look at the different product groups, look at the different drivers of the loss of biodiversity, land conversion, pollution, climate change, overexploitation, invasive species, but also at potential positive contributions, and score those product groups. And of course, this score is based on potential impact, because the real impact will depend on the specific production location and the environment. And in many cases, you will probably find that, for example, land conversion can be a big issue. And when I showed you the graph about what are the key issues, the priority issues that were mentioned, basically land use wasn't part of that. And while land use, of course, is a very important factor in this respect. If you have such an overview, then you could also have a look at the criteria, which you're currently using also within public procurement, and try to see, okay, so what do we already cover by the current criteria, and what are we maybe missing up until now? And of course, when you're missing something, the big question will be, can the market produce what we would like to have in this respect? This could also lead to some kind of a materiality matrix, where on the one side you would have the impact on biodiversity, could be negative, could also be positive, of course. And on the horizontal axis, one big question would be, are there market solutions for this? Are there alternatives available in the market that already provide a solution to a certain impact? Are there already alternatives available that provide a positive contribution that you could get? And there are also ways in procurement to do market research before you do the tender and to actually discuss with market partners what is possible and to tailor your tender to that. Life cycle costing benefits could be actual benefits translating into real financial benefits, could also be benefits from the viewpoint of externalities. And in the end, somewhere, somehow, someone will pay for those externalities. Again, when you source locally, those externalities could be very relevant for the specific government. And also contributions to policy, like I explained. If in a certain area, procuring certain products with maybe a positive influence on biodiversity could also have a positive influence on other policy objectives, like maybe climate adaptation or maybe health. And this would give you an idea as a government to see, okay, what should we focus on first and what could be next. There are very specific challenges as well, of course, and I mentioned 3 here. One is, at the bottom right, product composition. To what extent does government, but also do producers know what the composition of a specific product is? To what extent is traceability possible? Especially, I guess, in commodity markets, it may be very difficult to actually trace the raw materials in a product back to the actual production location. And when you're talking about biodiversity impacts, it's very location specific. So if you do life cycle costing, then what does that mean in a supply chain which is not fully traceable? So this is a challenge. Another challenge, top right, would be price. The fact that still a lot of decisions in public procurement are made based on price. It was already said this today as well, that within a company the procurement officer will look very differently at these issues. Probably the same goes for the procurement officer within government. And finally, life cycle costing. Very interesting concept to also be able to internalize externalities in procurement decisions, but an important precondition is that you can actually quantify and monetize the impact on biodiversity. And it will be interesting, I think, also to see to what extent the Natural Capital Protocol, for example, could provide solutions for this for valuation. These are some of the challenges. Governments, I guess, to a growing extent are focusing on the issue of natural capital in general, the issue of biodiversity more specifically, but these challenges will need to be overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's clear and how the day has evolved, and clearly looking, first of all, at the importance of not only focusing at the levels of the, let's say, the first tier of the supply chain, especially when it comes to biodiversity, the importance of really going all the way back to the source where a lot of the important impacts happen. It was interesting to see, the two different approaches with regards to the importance of the consumer. From the first perspective, the consumer as people, the second as governance, but overall, a strong message that there is an opportunity for this consumer level to drive change throughout the value chain, and what UEBT presents is a positive outlook that there is increased awareness around biodiversity, and that this can increasingly become an opportunity that companies and even governments can take advantage of. We'll go to look at the results of the second question. Okay, wow. Any reactions from the panel? No one?
Yeah, I'm happy to say something. One thing I missed in this, because you say the consumer can be the government, can be the people, but it is also for SMEs often other companies. So there you get the supply chain changes, and there's a lot that is happening through supply chain changes, which is not really voluntarily, and it's also not regulation. On the issue of regulation, as I gave my example, at the moment that the European Union started or adopted a law on access and benefit sharing, we've been trying to talk to companies about this issue for years. And at the moment that the EU adopted it, 2 years later or a year later, all companies are starting to look at it. So the potential and the power of regulation is very strong. At the same time, I'm sure that companies are not dying for more regulation.
Good. As we see the next question, the same with the previous presentation, I will take maximum 2 questions. If there's any clarification, and again, we will have more time to discuss this after all the presentations. Are there any questions with regards to the last presentation? No? Everyone's quite quiet in this session. Are you thinking about the reception and the drinks? Okay. So they've already displayed the third question. This is the final question, and how do you see who has the main responsibility for enhancing the business commitment to the biodiversity? Various options, and hopefully you can continue participating as you have done in the previous 2 questions. With this, I'll invite Jan Kees from Unilever